So to even just back up and think about like the book itself, right? So I was fortunate to travel to Antarctica in 2004. I've been fortunate to travel to a lot of places, so it's true. I humble brag. I've been to all seven continents. And usually when I go, I'm not thinking in terms of like how am I going to use this in my work. I just go just to see things. And then it usually happens is that years later, certain ideas come to me. So for example, I was in Mongolia in 2008, and I about 5 years after that, I got an idea for a book that I could set in Mongolia. And so the same thing with Antarctica. I was there 2004. And then I've been playing around, maybe around 2017, 2018. I've just been playing around with the idea of writing a modern adult version of Lord of the Flies that was set in Antarctica. And I was just thinking about it at the time. And then 2020 hits, the murder of George Floyd. And I began to think about how a book like that, like the one I was envisioning, could also really delve into issues of social justice and could be a lot more than just an adventure of whether or not people survive in Antarctica. So that was sort of the genesis of the book. Um, and so in thinking about that, I knew then that I had to have like a black main character, because I myself, I'm half black, half Vietnamese. And so in my fiction, I've had Asian characters, I've had white characters. So this is my first main character who is black. Um, and so I knew certain things about, this character as I was thinking it through. She would be of a certain age. Again, she would travel to Antarctica. She would be a bit of a lone wolf, in many kinds of ways. Um, and that basically, yeah, so she encounters these other people on this boat and ways in which they all end up sort of changing each other, etc. So basically, it's the Christmas holidays. So that means it's December, which means it's summer in Antarctica. And she is a film location scout. So her job is to go out and to find places to shoot movies. And so she's scouting for a movie that's going to be a biopic about Ernest Shackleton, who was the British Antarctic explorer, who very famously, he did a couple of expeditions, but one of his more famous expedition was the one in which his ship got mired in the ice and eventually sank. And I think it was 27 men, were part of that expedition. And over almost a 2 year period, they managed to survive. And so nobody died, which is just kind of an amazing feat. Oftentimes he's studied as like a great example of like executive leadership, like how do you, in these dire circumstances, lead 27 men like back, to safety. And so she's scouting, again, locations for this particular film. And something goes horribly wrong, let's just say. And so a small group of people who are on this boat. I should say too that it's not a cruise in the traditional set. People, because now you can take cruises to Antarctica, those big ships that have like 5,000 people on them. This is a small Russian icebreaker. It's an expeditionary boat. It only takes like 100 passengers and maybe also like 100 crew members in total. So it's much, much, much smaller. So like I said, something goes wrong, but that is why they were there. That's why she was there and what she was up to. The apt analogy with Gilligan's Island is that you have types, right? You have the millionaire and his wife, right? You've got the professor, you've got the movie star, right? So it's true that there are like quote unquote types, and much of the journey of the book is moving beyond that. Like Stryker has initial impressions of who these people are, but then over time that shifts, right? So there is, and again, because these kinds of voyages are very expensive. Most of the people who are on this particular boat are fairly wealthy and white. So very early on, before things have gone haywire, we're meeting this group of people who are going out kayaking on a little outing. And so there's 13 of them. So we meet like a family, the parents are doctors. One of the children is non-binary. We need another family that consists of three dads who have an adopted daughter. We meet a couple, an older couple, an elderly couple who are very wealthy. And we meet a tech titan and her husband. So she's the tech titan and he's the hubby. And so we meet them as well. There's also like their guide and also a couple of Russian crew members who have been paddling for the elderly couple in a tandem. So that's the small group of people who have broken off from the main ship. It's true that in the first 50 pages, Stryker herself has conceptions about people. She meets people, she makes certain kinds of stories up about them. She thinks she knows who they are. The book actually has an epigraph from W.E.B. Du Bois about the double consciousness. So it's a very famous idea that he had about a veil, that Black folks are only allowed, a certain kind of self-perception. Like they only see themselves through a world that only sees them like as one-dimensional sort of beings in certain kinds of ways. So perception is very important to this book. And so in thinking about the racial component to it, though, I hope that people stick it out to the end, because to me it truly is an arc. Like where she begins in her preconceptions of people is not where she ends in her preconceptions of people, right? So if people think like in those first 50 pages, like, oh, that's gonna, it's like, no, it's hopefully things are growing, right? Um, as far as like why I wanted to have those things in there, it's true that, I'm also I would say a new playwright. Like I've only had one play production done. But I've written more plays. And the theater world is a really interesting space as far as like racially and like, casting of characters and who's writing these characters and thinking about it. There's a way in which it's like it's obviously also true of like fiction and TV, but there's something about the theater that just makes it all so much more immediate, right? Um, and I came to realize from theater and from other spaces too, that oftentimes when we read these things, and that's I think why Get Out was, so just pivotal in how it portrayed things, is that historically, I think when there's like racial issues in a book, they tend to sometimes be, and this is obviously an old text, but more like Deliverance, where the white characters are evil or what have you, and it's easy for us as audience members to know, like, oh yeah, that is bad. That's a bad person. That's, whatever. And I wanted to create situations that were much more nuanced, right? And really that hopefully get people to question what they believe. So, for example, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, there's a scene in which the characters are having a conversation, um, about the racial history of the United States, and I work in various things that like I didn't know, but I had to learn, the fact that, for example, this isn't the US, but like Great Britain paid slave owners up until 2015 for like these were the families of slave owners. I think they were in Barbados. They paid them for quote unquote lost property. So when Barbados became free, I think it's Barbados. I don't think it's Jamaica, but when it became free, these people theoretically lost property, and so the government began like paying them like restitution, right? But of course, never paid anybody who was actually enslaved, right? There's a lot of facts like that are just like mind-boggling, and I wanted to create a space in which, like, hopefully, because of the survival element, people are interested in reading this, and then you also like learn things, right? And you get pushed in many ways, so it's not simplistic. So, yeah, I was interested in creating a book that sort of implicates all of us. And again, that includes Stryker. So I didn't want to be didactic or anything like that. But like I said, I was interested in pushing these conversations beyond just the normal, like, right and wrong, which is easy to understand, and into these more gray spaces. Yeah, I used to have a joke because, in 2020, I was out at a lot of like a lot of people, at various protests that were happening here in Madison. And I had a joke, although I never did it, that I was just going to have a sign that just said nuance, right? My sign just be nuance. And so yeah, I think because the gray spaces are where we live, it's easy in traditional horror. Obviously, horror has really changed over the years, and now you get many more things that are more nuanced. But traditionally, it was very like so and so is the villain, so and so is the heroine, so and so is going to survive, so and so is a bad person, so they won't survive, or what have you. You know what I mean? So yeah, I do think the gray spaces are really important. Antarctica, I obviously I've gone there and I was fascinated by it as a landscape. Like you can do just so much with it. Like, it really becomes a character because it's testing people to the utmost, right? The other thing that I was fascinated about with it is just the actual landscape itself. Technically, Antarctica is a desert because it gets less than a certain amount of precipitation per year. And also additionally, because of the cold temperatures, nothing there ever really rots. There is no decomposition. And so it's kind of like a land lost in time. And so in thinking about it as being a desert, when we think of traditional deserts, we think of like prophets going out to the desert and having visions, the desert is, a place that tests them. And so I thought of Antarctica as being like a similar kind of landscape. And then I would also say too that Antarctica is the only landmass that's ever actually been discovered by human beings. So when we talk about like the discovery of America, there were people here. When we talk about the discovery of the Arctic, there were people there, right? So those aren't true discoveries. Antarctica, again, is the only place that really has been discovered. So there's no culture, there's no cities, there's like none of that really. And so I was really interested in this idea that whatever happens in Antarctica is because you brought it with you. Like your inner demons, your inner life, your inner beliefs. There's no preconceived civilization that's there. It's what you bring. And so that's another way in which I knew that this landscape was just going to be really ripe for thinking about ways in which it tests the characters.